Okay, thank you, Vitor, for that introduction, and thank you guys for having us here in Georgia. It's been great to be out here and see a little bit more green grass. Wyoming's starting to dry up already, cool off a little bit. So it's been kind of fun to see a different environment. Wish I got to hang out and go tour some operations and do that stuff, so I'll have to come back at some point and do that. So I think yesterday's presentations started to touch on heifer development and the importance of fertility in those heifers, the importance of longevity, and I think they really set up what I'm hopefully going to talk about and share with you guys here today in thinking about nutritional management of our replacement heifers and how do we get reproductive success in those heifers. And I think I'm probably a little biased. My graduate work and my research now as a faculty member all focuses on heifer development, but I think it's one of the most important things that we do, right? That's our newest genetics coming into the herd. They're an opportunity for us to put selection pressure on fertility, put selection pressure on longevity, and keep improving that herd. So I think I'm going to start out just kind of talking about heifer development in general before we dive into more on the nutrition side. When we think about heifer development in general, it's one of the biggest economic decisions we make as a producer each year, right? Those heifers are an investment. We put a lot of time and a lot of money into those heifers, and it takes them a significant amount of time to start recouping those development costs and paying us back. We also know that if we look at the U.S., we have a wide variation in environmental and management conditions within our cow-calf production. Just myself, I grew up in California on a ranch. I did my graduate program in New Mexico. Now I'm in Wyoming. There's a lot of diversity there just between that. And what I do in Wyoming and the heifers we would pick there and the operations there are probably a lot different than what you guys are doing here in Georgia. Now, that being said, I think there's some really central questions that we can still ask ourselves. There's some central development strategies that we can use for reproductive success to push fertility and push longevity in those heifers. That first one being, are we going to retain and develop our own heifers, or are we going to purchase those heifers? Now, for the sake of today's talk, we're going to talk about retaining and developing our own heifers, but we could probably spend the whole time just arguing amongst us what's better, right? Is it better to purchase the new genetics in? Is it better to be keeping those genetics? So that's going to be the first thing we have to make a decision on as a producer. We also need to be thinking about how do we select the right heifer, right? How do we go out in that pen and pick that heifer that's going to consistently calve early? She's going to wean a nice big calf. She's going to get bred year after year, and she's going to stay in the herd a long time. Unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball that's going to tell you guys exactly how we do that. And I thought Dr. Rowan did a great job yesterday talking about some of the ways that we can put selection pressure on those heifers, some of the ways we can go about looking for fertility and longevity in those heifers. We also need to be thinking about, do our cows match our production environment, right? When we go out in that pen, we need to be thinking about picking out a heifer that's going to be productive in our specific environment. The cows that I would probably pick out, or the heifers I would pick out in Wyoming, are probably slightly different than what I would pick out if I were living in Georgia, right? I'm probably thinking about, can they handle the cold? Can they handle traveling long distances to eat feed? Whereas you guys are thinking about heat tolerance, right? You have different forage conditions. So thinking about how do we put pressure on those animals to fit that production environment. And then the last thing I want to touch on, just to kind of get us started, is thinking about the economic side of heifer development. So I have that figure on the bottom of the slide that is showing a balance between biological efficiency and economic efficiency, right? And we talk a lot about at this meeting, and it's really great, about fertility and trying to push fertility and maximize that. And that's really, really great, but we also need to think about the cost of that. And that's really important when we're thinking about those heifers, because we're putting a lot of money into them. And so how do we try to optimize that, right? Have good fertility at a relatively reasonable economic cost to us, right? So we need to be thinking about the break even for those heifers and actually putting pen to paper and calculating out how long it's going to take us to break even on those heifers, okay? Now, if you go back in the literature, there's several studies that did some economic analysis, and they say anywhere from 3 to 5 years, right, is kind of an average. I would say it takes about profit from 5 or 6 calves to break even on those heifers in an average development situation. But we also have some studies that show if we really pour the feed to those heifers in a dry lot situation and in a high input system, it could take 8 or 9 years. Now, I hope those heifers are staying in the herd for 8 or 9 years, right? But that's not going to turn us a lot of profit. So we really need to be thinking about them almost like we would a stocker operation. What's that break even? How am I going to get a return on that investment? Now, the other thing I like to do before we jump in on the nutrition side is think about that to-do list that heifer has, right? What are my expectations for her? Now, you probably have some other things that go on this list, but from a fertility, from a longevity standpoint, first thing I need that heifer to do is attain puberty prior to the breeding season, right? If my goal is to get her bred early in the breeding season, and we've heard about how important that is, and I'm going to touch on that here in a second, I need her to be cycling and hopefully have a couple cycles before that breeding season. Now, when we're talking about our Taurus type cattle, our British, our continental breeds, I'm probably not as worried about puberty attainment. We've done a great job as a beef industry, really pushing puberty and age at puberty and decreasing that. So it's really not a challenge as long as those heifers are being adequately fed. Now, our indicus, we maybe have some more hurdles there. It's something we need to be considering a little bit more. Next on that list is I'm hopefully, again, in a Taurus situation, she's becoming pregnant in time to calve by 2 years of age. That's my goal for her, right? And I not only want her to become pregnant within that confined breeding season, in an ideal world, I want her to become pregnant early. Okay, and we'll talk about why that's important again in here in a second. Hopefully she calves without assistance, right? She's going to wean that marketable calf, right? It's not done just because she gets bred. It's not done just because she calves. She needs to raise that calf through weaning, and hopefully it's not the little dink that we're all embarrassed to see when it comes in at weaning. Hopefully it's a nice big calf that's going to bring us some profit, right? And then probably her biggest hurdle up there is getting rebred as a first calf heifer, right? So she needs to be able to get rebred, hopefully maintain a 365-day calving interval, and then have adequate longevity, right? She's not going to break even that first year. It's going to take her several years. So she's hopefully staying in the herd long enough to not only break even, but also start turning us a profit. So I want to kind of reiterate, and I won't spend a lot of time because I feel like you guys have seen this data from Dr. Cushman several times during this meeting already, but talk about the influence of calving period on cow longevity, right? So in this study, again, they had about 16,000 head of heifers. They classified them based on when they calved during their very first calving season. So green line is those that calved in the first 21 days, black is that second calving period, red is anybody after 43 days into the calving season. And what we see is those animals that calved early in their very first calving season had a significant increase in longevity, right? We see a significant increase in the number of those heifers staying in the herd through 9 calving seasons. Now, we just talked about the economic side of it, so this is going to be important, right? We want those heifers to stay in the herd a long time. We follow that out, and they actually looked at weaning weights in those calves, and shouldn't be surprising that there was a difference in weaning weight that first year, but they actually have an increase in average weaning weight over their first 6 calves. If we add up the additional weaning weight of those first 6 calves, they wean almost a whole calf more over their lifetime. Now, with cattle prices the way they are, I would be pretty happy with that, right? Just the first year alone, we see a 133-pound difference in calf body weight. Now, with prices the way they are, that's anywhere from $300, $350 of added profit just by those animals calving early, right? So pushing those heifers to calve early, placing selection pressure for that can be really, really beneficial for us. Some ways to do that, just briefly, we could think about only retaining heifers that are bred in the first 30 days, right? We keep a few extra heifers, we turn the bull out at preg check, we have that vet tell us, or whoever's preg checking for us, tell us who's early bred, who's late bred. Anything that's late bred, we can go ahead and mark it as a bred heifer, okay? Get a nice profit off of her that way. Other way we could do it is maybe keep some additional heifers and only turn the bull out for 30 days. Okay, that seems a little scary, right? Only turning the bull out, okay? And market those open heifers as feeders. There's actually a producer that I work with up in Sheridan, Wyoming, who does this exact thing. He turns the bull out for 25 days. He actually doesn't sink. I wish he would, but he doesn't sink yet. Okay, he turns the bull out for 25 days with his heifers. Anything bred, that's what he's going to keep. Anything that's open, he's been able to market as a feeder calf and has done very, very nicely from a profitability standpoint on those feeder heifers as well. And then also incorporating some of those reproductive technologies like estrus synchronization that we've already talked about, okay? Because we know they will wean heavier calves and they will stay in the herd longer, right? So we're setting those heifers up for success. So let's jump into the nutrition side, right? Get back to what the title was on the talk, okay? And think about some nutritional programming or some developmental programming, okay? So Dr. Moriel talked a lot about fetal programming, but we also know that nutritional management after that calf's born, during that first year of life, can have a significant influence on setting them up from a fertility and a longevity standpoint. And I'll show you some data that kind of helps prove that, okay? So that nutritional programming postnatally, we know can have a significant influence on puberty attainment, as well as the size of the ovarian reserve and their potential longevity. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on puberty attainment because I don't think we have a huge issue with it. But I do want to talk about it just a little bit, okay? We actually know when we ask the question of can management decisions impact puberty attainment, that pre-weaning management actually has a greater influence on puberty than post-weaning management. So how we manage those calves early in life is really going to set up that puberty attainment more than how we manage them post-weaning. Now, that's not to say that post-weaning management doesn't have any influence, okay, but we can have a larger impact in that pre-weaning time period. And that's because we have some really important developmental windows from a puberty standpoint that happen early in life. Good example of this is this study from Gasser and others in 2006, where they looked at can early weaning hasten puberty. So these calves, heifers, were on 3 different treatments. They were all early weaned at approximately 104 days of age, and then were assigned to either a high concentrate diet or a control diet, and then their negative control was a normal weaned at 208 days of age and fed the control diet after weaning. Now, when we look at the percentage of heifers attaining puberty, we see that those heifers that were early weaned at 104 days of age and fed the high concentrate diet attained puberty at a much younger age compared to those heifers that were early weaned and placed on the kind of a normal diet or were normal weaned, right? Those early weaned and fed the control diet and those normal weaned calves, they attained puberty at roughly kind of these, at these same time points, okay? You can kind of see they're similar, whereas those early weaned calves fed that high concentrate diet attained puberty at a much younger age, okay? So I'm not saying you should early wean your calves and push high concentrate, but if we're having a puberty problem, maybe we have some indicus calves, we know that that nutrition during that time period can have a large impact on puberty attainment, okay? We also see this in a similar study from Cardoso and others in 2014. They had 40 crossbred heifers with some indicus influence there, with some Brahmin influence. All heifers were weaned at approximately 3.5 months of age, and then assigned to one of those 4 treatments. They were either low control, okay, so targeting 1.1 pounds per day of gain, high control targeting 2.2 pounds per day of gain, stair step 1, so that stair step is just different periods of high and low gain. And you'll hear that stair step concept come up again and again in this presentation. So stair step 1, they were kind of on a high plane of gain from 3 to 6 months of age, step down to a low, back to a high, back to a low. Stair step 2 is reverse sequence of that. So they started on a low gain, then step to a high, low, high, okay? So you can kind of see, I know these are really kind of small and a little bit hard to read right in the back of the room, but you can see on that far side we have body weight, so you guys can kind of see that those stair-step heifers end up achieving roughly about the same body weight as that high control. The low controls obviously gained a lot less weight at that lower body weight by the end of the study at about 14 months of age. That next figure is looking at puberty attainment, okay, and age at puberty attainment, and we can see the percentage of heifers pubertal, obviously the low control by the end of the study. We have a significant amount of those that have not attained puberty at that time point, okay. Our high control and our stair step 1 follow a very similar pattern, right? And so that starts to tell me that increase in nutrition early in age, that high concentrate, that higher gain, really pushed puberty attainment in those heifers. Now, what's interesting to me is I actually like the stair-step 2 group a little bit better. Okay, 70% of those heifers attained puberty between about 11 and 13 months of age. And we end up with a majority of those heifers pubertal by the end. Now, I say they're probably my favorite because we don't necessarily want precocious puberty, right? We don't want puberty to happen too early in those heifers. Okay, so that stair step 2 tells me that we can kind of really hone in and dial in the timing with our nutrition and impact puberty attainment within those heifers. Okay, so let's get to the fun stuff and talk about post-wean gain. That's kind of my favorite part where my research really focuses. So if you've read any heifer development article, you've ever heard any heifer development talk, you probably hear us talk about the target body weight approach, right? And we talk about developing heifers to approximately 60 to 60% of their mature body weight by breeding, okay? This has been a standard for a long time. This was built on a lot of really, really good data, but I'm gonna challenge you a little bit on that, okay? I think this is a really great number. The goal of a lot of the studies that led to this guideline to 60 to 65% was looking at maximizing puberty attainment in those heifers, getting them to have several cycles before the breeding season, and it was looking at maximizing pregnancy rates in those heifers. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but I hope you keyed in on them using the word maximizing there, right? And we talked about at the beginning this concept of optimizing, right? And so there were several studies that have been done over time and continue to be done in the Midwest, specifically Nebraska has done a lot that kind of challenged that and looked at a lighter target body weight approach, or utilizing a more low input system, putting those heifers out on pasture, maybe not pushing them as hard, to see if they could get similar reproductive performance with less economic inputs, right? And they were able to achieve that. We see that we can push those heifers to 55, 58% mature body weight, so a little bit lighter, and still have adequate reproductive performance in those heifers, and we decrease our development costs, okay? So this is probably maybe a little bit bigger of a deal when I'm talking in Wyoming and they're thinking about not as much grass as you guys have out here, right? But it's still a good concept to be thinking about, is what's the cost to develop those heifers? Can I maybe develop those heifers to a slightly lower percentage mature body weight and still be successful? Okay, the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is it kind of gets me thinking about, can we use post-weaning management to select heifers better adapted to their future production environment? So quite a few of these studies actually put heifers out grazing winter range, they put them out grazing corn residue, they put them in more extensive production environments. And to me, that ideal heifer, maybe if I know I'm gonna put that cow and she's gonna live the rest of her life in tough range conditions, okay, or even just out on pasture, am I better off figuring out those heifers that can handle that condition, right? They can get bred out in those conditions that I'm gonna treat the cow, okay, and hopefully get bred early. So my ideal heifer is probably the one that gets bred early, maybe didn't have as many inputs as a heifer, and still does all those other things on the checklist throughout her lifetime, okay? So that's what I would wanna be pushing for. Okay, so just some data to kind of back that up. Several of those studies, right, we're looking at more of a low gain versus a high gain approach throughout post-weaning development. You can see, as we would expect, that obviously pre-breeding body weight is going to be decreased in those low gain heifers. And several of those, the Funson and Deitcher study, that was a dry lot study on the low gain. The other two were more winter range and corn residue combos in Nebraska. Obviously, we do have some concerns, right, when we look at the percentage of those heifers that are pubertal at that start of the breeding season, right? We see some decreased puberty attainment. Okay, it does cause us a little bit of concern. But when we look at overall pregnancy rates, we actually see similar overall pregnancy rates throughout there, okay? Now, I will say that a couple of those first service conception rates are maybe decreased slightly, which goes against what I told you about getting heifers bred early. But this last study, Summers and others in 2014, they actually had an increase in first service conception rates. Okay, they had kind of a flushing effect in those heifers with an increase in nutrition as that grass was greening up as they were going into the breeding season. Okay, and they actually had an increase in first service conception rates there. So it is possible to do a low input system and still get those heifers bred early. If you look at the economics over here on the other side, we see a significant increase in the cost to develop one pregnant heifer, or cost per pregnant heifer, in those higher input studies. There was a really interesting study that was done several years ago in Tennessee from Dr. Zach McFarland and Dr. Travis Mullenix, where they looked at several low input grazing systems in Tennessee and compared it to kind of an economic simulation of developing those heifers in the dry lot and what that would have cost. And they see a significant increase, a $612 increase in investment costs in those heifers. And you can see there's a really big difference in the net present value there. Okay, so again, putting pencil to paper, I know we're supposed to be talking about nutrition, but the economic side is also important as well. Okay, so I want to jump into talking about the timing of weight gain on heifer reproductive performance, because we haven't really touched on that yet, right? And what's really cool is that hopefully by the end of this, you're seeing that you can develop heifers in all of these different ways and still be successful. There's been a lot of studies that have actually shown that we don't have to have heifers on this nice steady plane of nutrition from weaning all the way through the start of the breeding season. We can flex, and we can use more of a late gain system. That's what's being illustrated here, where we see kind of a comparison of heifers that were either on an even rate of gain or a late rate of gain, and they still end up with a similar pregnancy rate. So there was no difference in pregnancy rate in this study. And the authors actually say that they may have decreased development costs. Now, I wish they had actually calculated it, but their reasoning for decreasing development costs is when we limit this gain, okay, we're not in a negative energy balance or anything, we're limiting gain here, we actually see a period of compensatory growth, where they're taking those feed resources you're giving them and they're being more efficient. So we get an increase in feed efficiency through there with that compensatory growth period, so they're being more efficient with the resources that you're providing to them, okay? Now, there's been several other studies over the last few years that looked at a similar thing, okay, maybe not in the exact same way as that, but all of them continue to show that we have no difference in pregnancy rate when we use a variation in gain, okay? So we can change gain throughout these studies or throughout our heifer development systems and not have a significant impact on heifer pregnancy rate, okay? So that should be good news, right? I know I'm not telling you here's a silver bullet, this is exactly how you should develop your heifers and everything's gonna be perfect and they're all gonna get bred, okay? But this should be exciting that you have options, right? You can do what works best within your production system with your resources and your goals. The other thing to think about is not just how this development impacts their first pregnancy rate, okay, that first breeding season, but how does this influence that heifer's longevity? Now, the hard part is a lot of our studies don't necessarily look at longevity because we have a limited number of research animals. We can't keep them just doing nothing other than that study for long periods of time, but we do have several that look at that. A good example of that is this study from Dr. Travis Mullenix when he was in New Mexico. He developed heifers on 3 different treatments. They were either grazing native range in New Mexico, receiving a 50% ruminantly undegradable protein supplement, so 50% bypass protein, a 36% RUP or 36% bypass protein supplement, or they were developed in the dry lot. Okay, they had similar performance throughout that first breeding season, but he actually followed them out and looked at retention rate of the original heifers over 4 breeding years, okay? And so we see a tendency in those first 2 years for the 50% RUP group to have an increase in retention rate, and then you see it get statistically significant when we get out here to breeding year 3 and 4, where we have a significant advantage for those 50% RUP heifers that were developed out on range compared to the dry lot and their 36% RUP counterparts. Now they've been trying to mimic this study and figure out exactly what happened with that 50% RUP group. You know, that increase in bypass protein, that may have been part of it. But to me, big picture wise, when I read through this study, what it really tells me is how I manage those heifers from a nutritional standpoint and getting them used to that in production environment can be really beneficial, right? Now, hopefully at some point, Dr. Mullenix is going to be able to tell us this is exactly why the 50% was better, okay? And we'll be able to kind of replicate this and come up with more ideas along those lines. But again, I think it's an important concept to be thinking about and hitting back on that concept of getting these animals to fit their production environment, right? Maybe that 50% RUP supplement and grazing non-native range, they were able to better adapt to that production environment. Something about that combination made it where they're able to stay in the herd for a longer period of time, right? So that's more beneficial to us. Now, the other way that we can look at longevity in these heifers without having to keep heifers off of other studies and do other things is to look at the ovarian reserve, okay? So when we think about just ovarian physiology, I'm not going to try to get too far into the weeds with it and get too nerdy for you guys, right? But when we look at that ovary, when it's formed during gestation, okay, within that animal, she's going to form these primordial follicles, these microscopic follicles that she's going to have, and that's her total number of follicles that she's going to be able to have to ovulate over her lifetime. Okay, and we know from a fetal programming standpoint we can influence that with nutrition, but I want to talk about how we can influence this number potentially from a postnatal standpoint and post-weaning nutrition. Okay, so these heifers are born with a finite number of these follicles, okay, that she's going to use over a lifetime. It's the same thing in human women, okay? We're born with a finite number of those follicles. We also know that the size of the ovarian reserve corresponds with fertility, okay? So we see this when we look at antral follicle counts, right? So if we scan the ovaries, look at surface counts, we see high AFC animals have high numbers of primordial follicles, so we have ways to measure this. And we know that those animals with high antral follicle counts, high primordial follicle numbers, have improved pregnancy rates and different phenotypes that tell us that they're high fertility, okay? So there's been several studies where they looked at the influence of a stair-step development system on the ovarian reserve, okay? So this research really started in Nebraska at the USDA Center with Dr. Bob Cushman and Dr. Harvey Freetley. They weaned these heifers and they were placed on either a control treatment, which was just a constant rate of gain from weaning through the start of the breeding season, or a stair-step system where the first half of the development period they were on a lower rate of gain, and then about halfway through they were stepped up to a higher rate of gain, okay? At the end, when they would normally breed these heifers, they actually went ahead and ovexed them, so they took ovaries out and looked at microscopic follicle numbers, and what they saw was that we have this increase in the number of primordial follicles. Okay, so again, I've told you we can't change this number. They're born with it at birth. So this was a really interesting result. Okay, so some of the thought process is maybe we're slowing the rate at which we're using these follicles with that period of low gain. Okay, but the thought process again is that increase in primordial follicle numbers, increase of follicles for her to use over her lifetime, that would lead to a potential improvement in longevity. So during my PhD, I really wanted to complicate this because we have a lot of producers that develop heifers outside of a dry lot. They develop them out on range. And apparently I really wanted to feed a lot of heifers individually, okay? So we had 40 heifers at the Corona Range and Livestock Research Center assigned to one of 4 treatments. They were either constant gain dry lot, stair-step dry lot, constant gain native range, or stair-step native range, okay? So the native range groups were supplemented 3 days a week, and the others were fed every day. You can see roughly what the gains were. We did not do from weaning all the way through breeding. We did a 90-day pre-breeding development period. Halfway through, we did reproductive tract scores and did antral follicle counts. And then at the end, we did ovarectomy. So I'm sorry you're not going to see pregnancy data. I took the ovaries out. It gets a little hard to breed them when you do that. Okay? So when we looked at heifer performance, and you'll see why I'm showing you the performance here in a second, the dry lot heifers did exactly what they were supposed to. Okay, you can see that the stair-step group has this nice kind of increase in gain in that second half of the period. They got roughly to the end body weight we were looking at. They're much smaller framed animals there, so don't be alarmed by the body weight on the side there, okay? The native range heifers, New Mexico had a great spring. It greened up. Despite my best efforts of telling them not to eat quite so much, they really outperformed, and they kind of, both treatments kind of followed this stair step or this increased gain in that second half, despite my best efforts of supplementing the constant gains to not do that, okay? So because we couldn't do pregnancy rates because I took ovaries out, we did want to look at some metrics of fertility and how things would have gone during the breeding season. So one of the things we did was look at dominant follicle diameter on that ovary. Okay, what was really interesting was that we saw that we didn't have necessarily a treatment effect, but we had an increase in dominant follicle diameter in our native range. Okay, so we know that, you know, dominant follicle gains ovulatory capacity about 9 to 10 millimeters in diameter, but we saw some research yesterday from Dr. George Perry's lab that follicles greater than about 12.8 millimeters in diameter those heifers have an increase in pregnancy rate. Okay, so a larger follicle diameter is going to be better, and we see that increase in follicle diameter in those native range developed heifers compared to their dry lot counterparts. Now, that's not to say we were limiting fertility in the dry lot heifers. The native range heifers just outperformed a little bit. Okay, we saw a similar thing when we looked at follicular fluid hormone concentrations with an increase in estradiol within that dominant follicle, and that does kind of follow along with what we saw with the dominant follicle diameter. Again, we want a larger concentration of estradiol there, but when we looked at the ratio of estradiol to progesterone, where we want a ratio greater than 1, we have no difference there, again indicating we weren't limiting fertility in those dry lot heifers, but maybe more enhancing it in our native range developed heifers. Now, when we looked at the ovarian reserve, this was probably the part I was most nervous about as a student doing this and hoping I could replicate the work from Nebraska. We were able to see that increase in primordial follicle number in our stair-step dry lot compared to our constant gain dry lot heifers, so we were able to repeat that. We also saw an increase in primordial follicle numbers in our stair-step native range heifers, but what was intriguing is those constant gain native range heifers were intermediate. Okay, so they were similar to the stair-step developed heifers, and they were also similar to the constant gain dry lot heifers. Now, some of what I think happened is if you think about the body weight slide I showed you, right? Those dry lot constant, or the constant gain native range heifers kind of followed a natural increase when that grass greened up. Okay, so again, despite my best efforts to tell them to do otherwise, they kind of followed that naturally, even though I wasn't necessarily supplementing them to do that. Okay, but we do think that this increase in primordial follicle number may result in an increase in longevity. Dr. Freetley's actually followed this up and published a study in the last couple years looking at herd survival and longevity in these stair-step heifers, and is able to show that we do indeed see an increase in the percentage of heifers still calving at 6 years of age. So we are seeing that those stair-step developed heifers have not only an improved number of primordial follicles, but we also have more of them staying in the herd to calve through 6 years of age. Now, just some more data, because I didn't want to bore you guys with too many data slides on the stair step. We do see no differences in the percentage of pubertal by breeding, so no difference in puberty attainment between treatments. We have yet to actually see a difference in antral follicle count, so we're not seeing that difference in primordial follicle number be translated to antral follicle number, and in that last Freetley study, there was no difference in date of conception as a heifer. So we've actually been continuing this work in Wyoming now, doing several iterations, looking at not only the ovarian reserve, but also looking at uterine function and circulating progesterone concentrations. And so I have some preliminary data back on our progesterone concentrations. So 16 days before we ovex, we set these heifers up and are able to look at luteal phase progesterone concentrations. And what's been really exciting is that in our stair-step developed heifers, and the constant gain dry lot, the stair-step developed heifers and our constant gain pasture heifers have an increase in luteal phase progesterone concentrations compared to our dry lot constant gain heifers. Okay, so we are seeing some differences in not just the ovarian reserve, but other metrics that are telling us maybe fertility is enhanced in those stair-step developed heifers, which is pretty exciting. So the other thing I want to talk about here for a few minutes, and maybe be a little controversial, is think about, can we add value or increase efficiency in our replacement heifer systems? And so one way that I had the opportunity to look at doing that during my PhD was looking at utilizing growth promoting implants in our replacement heifers. So most of you have probably been told time and time again, never implant your replacement heifers, right? So that's why I said I'm being a little controversial. When I was in New Mexico, we had quite a few producers calling us asking, does that still stand? A lot of that research is fairly old. Is that still the case? What if we're in a situation where we have a lot of drought? We don't know that we're going to be able to keep any heifers. I could implant them. I could get some extra weight. If I end up being able to keep a few, did I just totally screw up reproduction and fertility in those heifers? And really wanted us to ask that question again. So in an effort to do that, we did several extensive studies where we looked at utilizing a Synovex C in these heifers at the branding time point, okay? So heifers were randomly assigned at branding as they came through the chute. Every other heifer got a Synovex C implant. And then we looked at performance and reproduction in those heifers over time. So what was exciting was that the implant did what it was supposed to. We see a nice increase in body weight at weaning time point. So had those producers been in the situation where they couldn't keep any heifers and had to either sell all or majority of their heifers, they would have had a nice increase in weaning weight in those heifers and a nice profit advantage there, okay? What was interesting was that we continued to see that increase in body weight through the yearling time point as well as through the start of the breeding season. Now, that implant would have long paid out, okay? That implant, the Synovex C implant, has a payout period of 90 to 100 days, okay? So there's the concentrations for you guys of what's in that implant, okay? So it would have long paid out, okay? But that weight advantage they had at weaning, they were able to maintain through the start of the breeding season, okay? So maybe there's some advantage there as well. The question they really wanted to know was what happened to reproduction. There was no difference in puberty attainment between those treatments, okay? We actually saw no statistical difference in first service conception rates between our control and implanted heifers, and final pregnancy rates were similar between those treatments as well, and with 97 and 94%, I was pretty happy with that over a 3-year period, okay? We continued to follow these heifers out, and so this is some preliminary data. I haven't had a chance to go back and add more to it as these heifers have been aging out, but we're so far not seeing any differences in retention rate either, okay? So that was kind of one of the other questions that we had was, well, do they stay in the herd the first year, but then they fall out over time? So far, we're not necessarily seeing that. Last thing I want to talk about is post-breeding nutritional management, right? We've talked about getting these heifers ready for the breeding season. Yesterday we visited about sync protocols and management in the breeding season, but it's important for us to stop, we don't want to stop thinking about nutrition at the breeding season, right? We don't want to AI turn the bull out and wave to those heifers and say, see you in the fall when we preg check, okay? We need to make sure that they continue on a good plane of nutrition, okay? They need to be continuing on a positive plane of nutrition, and we know that alterations in that plane of nutrition can have negative consequences on conception rates as well as embryo quality. And that should make sense, right? We think about what happens early in development, okay? We have a lot of different things happening to that embryo as it's developing right after breeding. Okay, so if we put all this work in and all this money in to develop them from a nutritional standpoint, we're going to AI, we're going to ester sync, we're going to do everything right, okay, we need to make sure that they're going to maintain that pregnancy, okay? So management during early gestation is very, very important, okay? There's several studies that kind of illustrate this. Dr. George Perry did some research when he was in South Dakota looking at different development systems post-breeding, okay, so heifers were developed either out on range, that's going to be the black bar, or in the dry lot, that's going to be the white bar, okay, they were developed to about 65% mature body weight, okay, you can see that 94 to 97% puberty attainment in those heifers, so we weren't limited by puberty attainment. They were all AI'd, and then post-AI, all of the heifers were placed out into pasture in South Dakota, okay. What happened to those dry lot heifers, right? They went from not having to work very hard for their feed, right, to now going out on pasture, and we see a 10% decrease in AI conception rates in those heifers due to that decrease in nutrition, or that change in nutrition. We also see he's got several other studies where they actually looked at activity level in those heifers. What's the first thing that heifers do when you put them in a pasture? They got to go run the fences, right? Is there any hole where I can get out? Can I create chaos today, right? So they're going to go do everything other than eating. Okay, we see a similar thing in this study from RIS and others in 2012. These were dry lot developed heifers. Instead of putting them out on pasture, they changed them post-breeding to 3 different gains, right? Either to lose weight, maintain weight, or gain weight. And what that study showed was that those heifers needed to stay on a positive plane of nutrition. Okay, we couldn't put them on a positive plane of nutrition and then change them to just maintaining. They needed to continue on a positive plane of nutrition. So if we're in a situation where maybe we have to develop heifers in a dry lot and we have to put them out on pasture post-breeding, there have been several other studies that showed that we can kind of rescue those conception rates by providing some additional supplementation to those heifers as they're transitioning out onto pasture. Okay, so really the goal should be maintaining that plane of nutrition, keeping them on that positive plane. That's really going to help them. So to kind of start wrapping up, hopefully you guys have kind of figured out that I focus a lot on the long-term implications, right? First, we know how to get heifers developed right to get good first season pregnancy rates. But what happens later on, right? I want to develop those heifers to make sure that they not only stay that first year, but they're breaking even, they're making us profit, so we can stay in business, okay? We know that post-weaning development systems can have a big influence on longevity. We're starting to figure that out and get more data to prove that, okay? As Dr. Rowan talked about yesterday, longevity and reproduction have relatively low heritability, right? It's really hard from a genetic standpoint to select for that, okay? We can do some work there, but hopefully I've showed you we can also use management to help there, right? We can use management to put selection pressure on those heifers. We can use management to maybe enhance some fertility and longevity in those heifers as well. And so I think we should be thinking about that as we're coming up with how we're going to develop these heifers. Okay, so just kind of some take-homes, right? Heifer development is unique for each of your operations, right? Probably what you do with your heifers and your goals is going to be different than what your neighbor does. It's certainly different how we develop heifers in Wyoming than maybe how we're going about it here in Georgia, because we have different goals. And so you need to be thinking about what works for you, and hopefully I've been able to show you there's a lot of different opportunities to develop heifers and get to a really positive and successful endpoint, okay? Decisions made regarding nutritional management of heifers during that first year of life can have a really significant impact on not only those first season pregnancy rates, but fertility in general and the ovarian reserve and longevity, okay? Also be thinking about, challenging some of the previous thoughts, right? Could I maybe use a growth promoting implant in those heifers? Is that a way for me to increase profit without decreasing reproduction and fertility in those heifers? And then consistency, right? And I think you've heard that throughout the last 2 days is the details matter, consistency matters in how we manage those heifers. And so I have my contact information there. I'm always happy to answer questions or talk about heifer development. Hopefully I kind of got us closer back to on track, but I'd be happy to take any questions you guys have.
Let's give Rosasco a hand. We're doing great on time. Have time for questions.
On that study that Rick Funston did in Nebraska, where they held back the one group, but at the end of the breeding season, they were equal in pregnancy. Do you know what the distribution of that pregnancies were? As far as, did they get pregnant early or were they pregnant late in the season?
So it certainly depends on which study of his that you look at, right? There are several of those. The low gain group did probably have a distribution more towards the end, right? And they maybe weren't, not as many cycling at the beginning. And so, I do think that distribution is shifted a little bit, but that summer study was actually from Rick Funston's group, and they actually saw an increase in first service conception rates. They used an MGA protocol to sync those heifers, so they brought them into the dry lot for that period to do that, and then turned them back out on range after the breeding season, and they had an increase in first service conception rates in those heifers. So I think there maybe maybe there's a combination, right? I don't know that we have to go low input all the way, but maybe there's a combination there to use.
When you're talking about supplements, and you may have covered it, but and the quality, but the quantity, any measurement of the amount per animal that they received, or did you dictate that, or was it just broad, or how is that measured at all?
So any of these studies, we would be keeping track and have very specific amounts, right? When we're trying to achieve those specific gains, we would either be feeding them a specific amount or feeding them on a percentage of body weight for that supplement. So the stair-step studies specifically that I've done, the ones in New Mexico, we had a percentage of body weight. So I was weighing those heifers every 2 weeks. We were updating how much supplement they were getting. I can certainly get you that information. I tend to not put, this is exactly what the diet was, this is exactly how much we fed, because it's going to change based on location, what you're feeding, all of those kind of things. But any of those studies would have exactly what they did from a nutritional standpoint, so I'm happy to share any of that with you.
All right, let's give Dr. Rosasco another hand.